Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine hearing this statistic. Some studies suggest maybe as many as 1 in 5 top business leaders might have psychopathic tendencies.
Yeah, that's a really startling number when you put it against the general population, right? Only about 1% there.
Exactly. It really makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah,
About, personality and how it shows up in different places.
absolutely. It kind of forces us to look closer at these traits, the ones that really impact things. So in this deep dive, we're going to explore sociopathy, or what doctors call antisocial personality disorder.
Right. And related things like psychopathy.
Exactly. We'll dig into what defines these patterns, how that lack of empathy gets hidden because it often does, and, well, if certain groups or activities actually show more of these traits, according to the research anyway.
Yeah, we've pulled together some pretty interesting stuff for this. We're looking at psychological studies, on business leaders, on athletes too.
hmm And also analyses of people into extreme sports, what drives them, plus some broader perspectives on wealth and behavior.
Our goal here really is just to give you a quick but solid understanding of a pretty complex topic.
Yeah, we're not trying to slap labels on anyone. It's more about pulling out the surprising facts, the key insights from what we've read, so you get a clearer picture without wading through, like, heavy academic jargon.
Okay, so defining sociopathy, antisocial personality disorder. Where do we start? What are the main things to look for?
Well, the DSM-IV, which is, a standard guide for mental health stuff, it defines it by this ongoing pattern of basically disregarding and violating other people's rights.
And that starts early.
Typically, yeah,
Yeah.
childhood or early teens, and then it just continues into adulthood. It's actually grouped in what they call the dramatic cluster of personality disorders.
Dramatocerratic. That paints a picture. So
Right.
what does that actually look like, behavior-wise?
You see a few key things pretty often. One big one is manipulation,
Hmm.
exploiting others for their own gain.
Okay. That often goes along with, say, criminal behavior, running into trouble with the law. Impulsive actions are common too. Maybe a history of arrests.
Yeah.
Also, things like compulsive lying sometimes for no clear reason and just putting others at risk for their own benefit. And maybe the most striking thing is often a real lack of remorse, no guilt. Plus, just a general disregard for social rules, for laws.
That sounds like a pretty clear pattern, but I guess it's not always obvious when you first meet someone. Like, how do they manage? How do they hide that lack of empathy?
That's a really key point. A lot of people with these traits are actually, well, pretty skilled at hiding it. They can be very manipulative.
Using charm.
Exactly. Wit, charm, intelligence. They can seem really appealing on the surface,
Yeah.
engaging, charismatic even.
But it's a front.
Often, yes. It's like
Yeah.
a carefully built mask to hide the coldness underneath. It helps them exploit people more effectively, basically, get what they want without caring about the impact.
That's, yeah, unsettling. Which brings us back to that statistic about business leaders. 1 in 5. Potentially, yes. Up
Oh,
to 20% in some studies might show these tendencies. That's, as you said, way higher than in the general population.
so why? Is there something about that world? Does it attract people like that or maybe even reward those traits?
Well, the research suggests a connection. Certain traits can be, good and bad in leadership.
Like what?
Things like high entitlement, maybe, that can fuel ambition,
Right.
right? But it can also mean exploiting people or courage and risk-taking, seen as positives in business.
Definitely.
But in some people, those same traits are tied up with being impulsive, maybe even antisocial. It's a kind of fine line.
That double-edged sword idea. You think of figures like Steve Jobs, maybe Elon Musk, clearly brilliant innovators,
Right.
but also stories about ego, maybe antisocial stuff, parking in disabled spots, bullying, those really combative online rants.
Exactly. And while those behaviors aren't, a diagnosis in themselves, they can hint at patterns, low empathy, maybe a disregard for norms.
But we have to be careful not to paint everyone with the same brush.
Oh, absolutely. It's crucial. Not every successful or wealthy person is like that. Not by a long shot. There's a huge range of behavior. Correlation isn't causation, as they say.
Okay. What about extreme sports? that whole world involves taking massive risks.
Yeah.
Seems like there might be a connection there, too.
That's another really fascinating area, yeah. Extreme sports, I mean, the danger is right there, front and center, and they often attract people who talk about that intense focus, that feeling of flow.
Right.
There's some thinking, maybe even a genetic link, something to do with risk-seeking, how the brain handles dopamine perhaps, and you get those massive surges of adrenaline, dopamine, endorphins. It can be really addictive for some people.
Like you're chasing that feeling.
You could say that.
Yeah.
And interestingly, for some people with severe ADHD, these super intense activities can actually feel calming, might help balance things out in their brain.
Huh. That's counterintuitive.
It is. But then you look at some specific stories of extreme athletes, and you do see patterns that make you wonder about other underlying stuff.
Like Dean Potter, Dan Osman. Those guys pushed it incredibly far.
Exactly. Potter, with his free soloing and base jumping in places most people wouldn't dream of. He talked about death almost casually sometime.
And Osman.
Yeah, Dan Osman, known for those crazy rope jumps. He had a history of impulsive stuff, run-ins with the law, behaviors that might suggest, ADHD, maybe conduct disorder, even narcissism. His reaction when a friend died on a jump, calling it pilot error, well, you could see that as lacking empathy, too.
And the fatality rates in things like base jumping, wingsuit flying, they're just incredibly high.
Undeniably. The risks are immense, and there seems to be an acceptance of that danger that's quite profound.
But again, we shouldn't just label everyone who likes an adrenaline rush. Right?
Yeah.
There's a difference between calculated risk and just not caring about consequences.
Absolutely critical distinction. People do extreme sports for lots of reasons, and honestly, we need more research here too, especially on female athletes. A lot of the studies have focused heavily on men.
Good point. So, stepping back from the most extreme examples, what about athletes in general? Does broader research show higher rates of these dark triad traits? Psychopathy, narcissism?
Yeah, the research covering athletes more broadly, looking at that dark triad, psychopathy, narcissism, Machiavellianism, it does show some trends.
Okay.
You tend to see higher psychopathy scores in male athletes, particularly in what they call game events, direct competition compared to record events like, say, track and field, where it's more about beating a time or distance.
Interesting. So the head-to-head element matters.
It seems to. Male athletes also score higher on psychopathy compared to female athletes in those competitive game-style sports.
And any other links?
Yeah.
Like with mental toughness?
Yes. Interestingly, psychopathy seems to be negatively correlated with mental toughness, meaning higher psychopathy, lower mental toughness. Narcissism, that actually shows a positive correlation with mental toughness.
Really? So a bit of narcissism might actually help with resilience in sports?
It could suggest that, yeah, different parts of that dark triad might play different roles. We also see links between male athletes, narcissism, psychopathy, and exercise addiction.
Okay.
And specifically, male elite athletes in individual sports often score higher on psychopathy compared to female athletes, non-elite ones, or team sport athletes.
What about performance-enhancing drugs, like steroids? Any connection there?
There is, yeah. Studies looking at gym goers and weightlifters have found a pretty significant link between using anabolic steroids, or AS, and psychopathology, specifically narcissistic and antisocial personality disorders.
So using steroids increases the likelihood?
It appears so. People using AS were much more likely to show psychopathic traits, and the more different types of drugs they used, the higher the odds seem to be.
Wow. So it could be the drugs amplifying things or maybe attracting people with those tendencies to begin with.
It's probably complex. That relationship definitely needs more study to pin down cause and effect, but the link is there in the data.
Any research on coaches?
A little bit. Interestingly, studies on successful swimming coaches found links to Machiavellianism being cunning, manipulative, and narcissism, but not necessarily higher psychopathy.
Huh. Another nuance. Okay, what about the people watching, the fans? Do we see any of this in sports spectators?
That's another area where some research raises, well, some red flags, especially for fans of high-contact sports, think hockey, MMA.
Right.
Studies suggest a link between psychopathic traits in fans and being more drawn to fights, maybe more likely to get involved in trouble at games.
So, higher psychopathy scores correlate with being more likely to join in crowd aggression.
Yes, positively correlated with joining in, and negatively correlated with trying to calm things down, peacekeeping behaviors in a rowdy crowd.
So for some fans, maybe the violence or the potential for it is part of the appeal?
It seems that way for some. Research on MMA fans, for example, suggested that those scoring higher on psychopathy might be less bothered by violence, less morally concerned about it.
And football fans.
Similar findings. Psychopathy was found to predict feelings of entitlement and antisocial intentions related to being a fan.
But you mentioned a potential bias in this research.
Yeah, it's worth noting that historically, a lot of research on fan behavior has focused predominantly on male fans, so our understanding may be incomplete regarding female spectators.
Okay, good point. Now, shifting location a bit, we have some material that touches on resort areas, particularly in Mexico, places like Quintana Roo, Riviera Nayarit, Baja California Sur. Does that data give us actual rates of sociopathy there?
No, the sources we looked at don't really provide specific numbers like prevalence rates of sociopathy in those tourist areas.
Okay.
What the material does talk about, though, are the labor practices.
Hmm.
Sometimes low wages, not many protections for workers, long hours, unpredictable schedules. That kind of precarious work is pretty common in the tourism industry in lots of places.
So no direct numbers on sociopathy itself, but you're saying the conditions might be relevant. Like, could systems with vulnerable workers potentially attract or be exploited by people with those exploitative antisocial tendencies?
It's certainly a possibility you could infer. An environment where people are vulnerable could potentially be exploited by individuals who lack empathy and tend to manipulate, but that's an inference based on the economic situation described.
Right.
Our sources don't draw a direct line or give us data saying, yes, sociopathy rates are higher here because of this. It's just not in the information we have.
And similarly for those other specific activities mentioned, like
Right.
competitive pickleball in Los Barriles or kite surfing, wing foiling in La Ventana, sport fishing in Baja, no specific data on sociopathy rates there either.
Correct. None of the sources we reviewed provided any specific data linking sociopathy rates to those particular activities or locations. So we really can't make any claims about whether rates are higher or lower in those specific groups or places.
Got it. Sticking to the evidence. Wait, so as we sort of bring this deep dive to a close, what are the main things we should take away about sociopathy and where we might see these traits?
Well, I think first, remembering what defines it. That consistent pattern of disregarding others' rights, violating norms, and crucially, how it can be hidden behind, charm or manipulation.
Right, the mask.
Exactly. Then there's the research suggesting potentially higher rates of psychopathic traits in certain groups. Business leaders, for example, where maybe traits like risk-taking or entitlement are more common or even valued sometimes.
And in sports.
Yeah, in sports too. Connections with extreme risk-taking, competitive aggression, maybe even steroid use. And as we just discussed, potentially among some spectators drawn to aggression.
But it's complex. We shouldn't overgeneralize.
Definitely not. It's vital to avoid stereotypes. Human behavior is complicated everywhere. But that potential for higher prevalence in some leadership roles, that's definitely something worth thinking about more.
It really is. It leaves you with some big questions,
Yeah.
doesn't it? Like, if these traits might be more common in influential positions or certain high-stakes activities, what does that mean for us, for society?
Mm-hmm.
How does it affect trust, ethics, even how we think about success or what it means to take risks? It definitely makes you consider the darker sides of human behavior and how they ripple outwards.
It does. And maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. Knowing this, how does it change how you look at leadership or competition or why people push themselves to extremes? It's definitely a topic with some hefty societal implications to keep thinking about.